To measure the passage of a human life against the staggering breadth of the Paleozoic is to watch a single spark vanish in a tempest of shadows. We exist in a fleeting moment of atmospheric stability, a thin sliver of light and oxygen, yet beneath the surface of our consciousness lies a memory of the crushing, silent deep. Before the first tree reached for a sky that was not yet blue, before the first lung drew breath from an alien atmosphere, there was the abyss. It is a place where time is not measured by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow tectonic pulse of the Earth's cooling crust and the steady rhythmic accumulation of marine snow. Here, in the primordial cradle of the world, the weight of the water is a physical presence, a cold and indifferent hand pressing down with the force of 1,000 atmospheres. This is the foundation of our history, a realm of high viscosity and total darkness, where the chemistry of life began its long, agonizing crawl toward the light. The water of the early Paleozoic ocean is not the bright, translucent blue of a modern shoreline. It is a dense, mineral-rich soup, thick with the metallic tang of dissolved iron and the sulfurous breath of the mantle. At these depths, the pressure is an absolute ruler, dictating the very geometry of existence. The molecular structure of the water itself seems to change, becoming a heavy obsidian shroud that swallows all sound and motion. There is no weather here, no seasons, only the eternal stillness of the bathypelagic void. Yet if one listens with the soul rather than the ear, there is a vibration, a low-frequency hum of tectonic plates grinding against one another, the slow birth of continents, and the distant muffled roar of hydrothermal vents spewing superheated toxins into the freezing brine. This is the environment that forged the first complex nervous systems, requiring a biological resilience that defies the fragility of our modern forms. In this crushing gloom, the first masters of the deep began to take shape, their bodies governed by the unforgiving laws of hydrostatic equilibrium. We see the emergence of the early cephalopods, creatures of soft tissue and rigid internal logic, navigating the dark through a sophisticated network of chemoreceptors. Their nervous systems are masterpieces of prehistoric engineering, designed to process the subtle shifts in pressure and the faint electrical signatures of a world without sight. To move in this environment is to fight against the density of time itself. Every pulse of a mantle, every undulation of a primitive fin is a calculated expenditure of energy in a world where calories are as rare as starlight. The anatomy of these early titans was a testament to the power of the void eyes that would eventually grow to the size of dinner plates, designed to capture the single, lonely photon of bioluminescence, and skin that felt the vibration of a predator's approach from miles away through the conductive silence of the deep. We are but ghosts in this landscape, fragile observers of a majesty that does not require our gaze. The Paleozoic Abyss reminds us that the Earth is not a stage built for humanity, but a vast ancient machine of which we are a mere byproduct. As the pressure continues to mount and the darkness deepens, the boundary between the living and the mineral begins to blur. We are drifting now into the deeper strata of history, where the weight of the water becomes the weight of the ages. The transition from the chemical silence of the Archean into the atmospheric upheaval of the Proterozoic was not a sudden event, but a slow, agonizing transformation of the planetary skin. To a human observer, the passage of a million years is in abstraction, yet in the deep time of the Paleozoic, it is merely a rhythmic inhalation of the Earth. We move now from the crushing weight of the lightless vents into a period of profound chemical warfare, where the very composition of the ocean began to shift under the influence of a microscopic rebellion. The Great Oxidation Event was the first true global revolution, a biological coup that poisoned the anaerobic world and paved the way for the complex, oxygen-hungry monsters of the abyss. This was the moment the Earth began to breathe, that the breath was a searing, corrosive gas that threatened to extinguish the very life that created it. The sensory profile of this era is defined by the shifting clarity of the water. As free oxygen began to saturate the oceans, it reacted with the dissolved ferrous iron that had colored the seas a deep, murky green for eons. The result was a planetary-scale precipitation, a literal rain of rust. For thousands of years, the seafloor was blanketed in a fine red dust as iron oxide settled into the banded iron formations that we mine today. The viscosity of the water remained heavy, but its chemistry was becoming more reactive, more volatile. The tectonic plates continued their slow, ponderous dance, opening new gateways for oceanic currents to circulate this new, oxygenated brine into the deepest trenches. The pressure at these depths remained an absolute constant, but the flavor of the abyss was changing from the metallic tang of sulfur to the sharp, cold bite of O2. Amidst this invisible storm, the first complex cellular structures, the eukaryotes, began to experiment with the terrifying potential of aerobic metabolism. In the quiet gloom of the benthic zones, life was learning to burn oxygen to fuel more sophisticated biological machinery. We see the development of the mitochondria, the captured ancestor that became the engine of all complex life. This was an evolutionary milestone of unparalleled significance. It allowed for the creation of larger bodies, more intricate nervous systems, and the first hints of predatory intent. The biological mechanics of these early organisms were a study in extreme efficiency. Without the need for high-speed pursuit, their forms were soft, translucent, and governed by the slow diffusion of gases across permeable membranes. They were the architects of a new world, drifting in the oxygen-rich currents like spectral feathers in a lightless sky. The anatomy of these early pioneers was dictated by the lack of hard parts. There were no shells yet, no bones, and no teeth. Life was a soft, pulsating jelly, a collection of hydrostatic skeletons that relied on the pressure of the surrounding water to maintain their integrity. These were the ancestors of the giants to come, tiny flickers of complexity in a vast cold theatre of chemical transition. To contemplate this era is to recognize the fragility of the bridge between the simple and the complex. We are the descendants of those who survived the oxidation of the world, a lineage born from a catastrophe that reshaped the very molecules of the sea. The transition from the chemical volatility of the Great Oxidation Event leads us into a period of profound, ghostly serenity. If the history of our species is a frantic heartbeat, the Ediacaran period is a long, slow exhalation that lasted for millions of years. This was the era of the Garden of Ediacara, a time before the invention of the jaw, the claw, or the tooth. In the deep, silty reaches of the ocean floor, life existed in a state of meditative stillness that is almost impossible for the modern mind to comprehend. There was no pursuit, no flight, and no sound other than the rhythmic pulse of the tides and the low tectonic groan of the breaking Rhodinian supercontinent. Here, the first large-scale multicellular organisms began to carpet the seafloor, living in a world defined by communal absorption and a total absence of aggression. The environment of the Ediacaran Deep was a landscape of microbial mats, thick, leathery carpets of bacteria that stabilized the sediment and created a velvet-like surface upon which the first enigmas of deep time could rest. The water was cool and saturated with minerals, its movement sluggish and heavy. In this low-energy world, the crushing pressure of the abyss acted as a stabilizing force rather than a threat. There were no eyes to pierce the darkness, for the concept of sight had not yet been written into the genetic code. Instead, life was a sensory experience of touch and chemical gradients. The organisms of this time, such as the iconic Dickinsonia, were masterpieces of fractal geometry. They were flat, ribbed discs, some growing to over a meter in length, yet they were only millimeters thick. They did not have digestive tracts as we understand them. Instead, they sat motionlessly upon the microbial mats, absorbing nutrients directly through their underside in a process of slow, silent osmosis. The biological mechanics of these creatures represent a lost experiment in the history of life. Many Ediacaran forms utilized a quilted body plan, a series of fluid-filled chambers that provided structural rigidity through hydrostatic pressure. This allowed them to maintain complex shapes without the need for a mineralized skeleton. Charniodiscus, a frond-like organism anchored to the seafloor by a bulbous holdfast, swayed in the deep currents like a ghostly underwater fern. Its anatomy was a study in surface area maximization, designed to filter organic particles from the water column with hypnotic efficiency. These organisms possessed a radial or glide reflection symmetry that feels alien to our bilateral world. They were not ancestors in the direct sense, so much as they were a parallel reality, a vision of what life could be when competition is absent, and the environment is a provider rather than an adversary. Yet, this garden of tranquility was built on a foundation of looming obsolescence. As we drift through the Ediacaran bloom, observing these soft, pulsating quilts of flesh, we are witnessing the final days of a world without consequence. The silence of the Ediacaran Deep is the silence of the Ediacaran Deep is the silence of a library before a storm. Beneath the surface of the microbial mats, the first burrowing organisms were beginning to churn the sediment, an act of biological bulldozing that would eventually destroy the very habitat the Ediacaran giants relied upon. We stand on the precipice of the most violent transition in the history of the planet, where the peaceful absorption of the Ediacaran will be shattered by the arrival of the hunter. The darkness is about to wake up. The transition from the velvet stillness of the Ediacaran into the Cambrian is not merely a change in geological strata, it is the birth of the kinetic world. To compare our modern era to the Cambrian explosion is to compare a quiet pond to a shattering glass cathedral. For nearly 3 billion years, life had been a slow chemical meditation, a languid drift of soft tissues. But as the world crossed the threshold into the Cambrian, approximately 541 million years ago, the pace of evolution accelerated into a frantic predatory race. The silence of the abyss was broken by the mechanical scraping of chitin, the rhythmic pulsing of complex muscles, and the sudden, terrifying arrival of the first true eyes. This was the moment the abyss began to look back. The environment of the early Cambrian was a theatre of radical geophysical change. The breaking of the supercontinent Pannotia released vast quantities of calcium and carbonate into the oceans, shifting the very pH of the sea. The water was becoming a construction site. In the previous era, the lack of minerals meant that bodies were soft and vulnerable, but now the oceans were supersaturated with the building blocks of armor. The hydrostatic pressure of the deep was no longer the only force shaping the inhabitants. Life began to pull minerals from the brine, weaving stone into its flesh. The sensory landscape shifted from the tactile absorption of the Ediacaran to a high-stakes arena of light and vibration. The first eyes, primitive but revolutionary, began to detect the movement of shadows against the faint shimmering glow of bioluminescence and the refracted rays of the surface world. Among the most significant biological milestones of this era was the development of the Lachestadt ecosystems, such as the Burgess Shale. These sites preserve a moment in time when the anatomy of life became almost hallucinogenic in its variety. We see the emergence of Opabinia, a creature so surreal it defies our understanding of bilateral symmetry, possessing 5 stalked eyes and a flexible vacuum-like proboscis. Its nervous system was a pioneer in sensory integration, processing 5 separate visual inputs to track prey in a 3-dimensional aquatic void. The biological mechanics of these creatures were increasingly focused on propulsion and capture. The development of the coelomer fluid-filled body cavity provided a structural base for more powerful muscular contractions, allowing for the first high-speed pursuits in the history of the planet. This was the era of the first arms race. As predators developed a means to see and strike, prey responded with an explosion of defensive engineering. We observe the rise of trilobites, their bodies encased in segmented carapaces of calcite, a sophisticated mineral armor that provided protection against the crushing mandibles of the deep. Their anatomy was a marvel of modularity, with specialized limbs for sensing, feeding, and locomotion. The Cambrian was not just an explosion of forms, but an explosion of intent. For the first time, life was not merely existing, it was competing, hiding, and hunting. As we descend further into this transformative era, we realize that the peace of the deep time was gone forever, replaced by a relentless drive for survival that continues in our own veins. The transition from the frantic diversity of the early Cambrian leads us to the throne of the world's first true titan. To understand the scale of Anomalocaris canadensis is to recognize the moment that the concept of the apex predator was etched into the blueprint of life. In our modern world, we look to the great white shark or the orca as the masters of the blue, yet their reign is a mere echo of the terror commanded by this undulating giant of the Paleozoic. Measuring up to a meter in length, a colossal scale for an era dominated by creatures the size of a human thumb, Anomalocaris was the first organism to turn the water into a hunting ground of calculated mechanical precision. It did not merely drift, it patrolled. The environment of the Burgess Shale Sea was a realm of precarious stability. The water was a thick, viscous medium that Anomalocaris mastered through a sophisticated application of fluid dynamics. Its body was flanked by a series of overlapping lobes that moved in a rhythmic, wave-like motion, similar to the undulating fins of a modern cuttlefish. This biological propulsion system allowed it to glide through the water column with minimal turbulence, making it a silent phantom in the crushing bloom. The pressure here, while immense, was a tool for the creature. Its exoskeleton was not a heavy, mineralized shell like that of the trilobite, but a flexible, chitinous frame that allowed for high-speed maneuvering. To a trilobite scuttling across the silt, the arrival of Anomalocaris was heralded by a low-frequency vibration, the sound of a predator that had solved the problem of gravity in a liquid world. The anatomy of Anomalocaris was a terrifying masterclass in sensory and predatory engineering. Its most striking features were its two frontal appendages, barbed, segmented limbs that could whip forward with startling velocity to snatch prey from the sediment. These limbs were controlled by a complex muscular network that represents one of the first instances of high-torque biological movement. But the true horror lay in its mouth, a ring of hardened plates known as a circlet, resembling a pineapple slice lined with sharp, inward-facing teeth. This radial mouth did not close like a human jaw, but constricted with a rhythmic grinding motion capable of fracturing the calcite shells of its victims. Supporting this lethal machinery were two massive compound eyes mounted on stalks. These eyes contained thousands of individual lenses, providing Anomalocaris with a panoramic high-resolution view of the abyssivisual advantage that rendered the camouflage of its prey almost entirely obsolete. The nervous system required to coordinate such a complex array of sensory input and motor output marked a radical leap in evolutionary intelligence. Anomalocaris possessed a centralized brain capable of integrating visual data with the tactile feedback from its frontal limbs, allowing it to calculate intercept trajectories in real time. This was the birth of the strategic mind. As we watch this shadow glide over the Cambrian seafloor, we are witnessing the ancestor of all ambition. The existence of such a specialized killer forced the rest of life to innovate or perish, driving the development of even thicker armor and more complex burrowing behaviors. The reign of the abnormal shrimp was the fire that forged the resilience of all subsequent lineages. It reminds us that in the deep time of our planet, the beauty of form is often written in the language of the hunt. The transition from the reign of the apex predator to the frantic survival of the small leads us to one of the most bizarre chapters in the history of life. If Anomalocaris represented the perfection of the hunt, then the creatures that lived in its shadow represented the absolute limits of defensive biological architecture. Among these, none is more surreal than Hallucigenia sparsa. To look upon its fossilized remains is to witness a creature that seems to defy the very laws of terrestrial biology, a spindly, phantasmagoric entity that appears as if it were birthed from a fever dream rather than the cold chemistry of the Cambrian Sea. This tiny organism, barely the length of a human fingernail, was a master of a different kind of survival, the art of being impossible to swallow. The environment inhabited by Hallucigenia was the treacherous, silty floor of the deep shelf, a place where every shadow contained a potential ending. The water here was thick with the scent of decay and the electric hum of larger predators. For a creature as small and slow as Hallucigenia, the crushing pressure of the abyss was not the primary threat. Rather, it was the mechanical violence of the arms race occurring in the water column above. To survive, it had to evolve a body plan that turned its very existence into a lethal deterrent. Its anatomy was a study in spikes and stilts. On its dorsal side, a row of long, rigid, calcified spines pointed toward the lightless sky, creating a forest of needles that warned any passing predator of the cost of an attack. On its ventral side, 7 pairs of delicate, claw-tipped tentacles acted as stilts, allowing it to pick its way across the microbial mats with a slow, rhythmic gait. The biological mechanics of Hallucigenia were for a long time a mystery to modern science, with early reconstructions even placing the creature upside down and backward. We now understand that its nervous system was centered around a simple, elongated brain and a pair of primitive eyes that sensed changes in luminosity. Its head was a bulbous, unremarkable structure, but its throat was lined with a sophisticated array of microscopic teeth, a circular arrangement designed to create a suction that pulled in organic particles and tiny microorganisms. This was a tube within a tube body plan, a fundamental evolutionary milestone that allowed for a continuous digestive process. Despite its fragile appearance, the hydrostatic integrity of its body was remarkably resilient, maintained by a complex internal fluid pressure that allowed its soft tissues to survive the same depths as the armored trilobites. The existence of Hallucigenia illustrates the sheer creativity of evolution when pushed by the extreme pressures of predation. It was a specialist in the niche of the undesirable, a creature that traded speed and size for a needle-sharp invulnerability. Its spines were not merely passive armor. They were a signal, a visual and tactile message sent through the darkness that life is tenacious and will defend its spark with every resource at its disposal. As we observe this tiny, spiked ghost navigating the Cambrian silt, we are reminded that in the deep time of the Paleozoic, the small were just as influential as the giants. Every spine, every claw, and every microscopic tooth was a brick in the foundation of the complex world we inhabit today. The monsters of the abyss were not always the ones who hunted. Sometimes they were the ones who refused to be eaten. The transition from the bizarre experiments of the Burgess Shale leads us to a creature that would come to define the very concept of Paleozoic endurance. To gaze into the face of a trilobite is to look upon the first true witness of the world's history. For nearly 300 million years, these segmented mariners governed the seafloor, surviving 5 separate extinction pulses through a masterpiece of biological engineering. Their reign was not built on sheer size or predatory violence, but on the perfection of the eye. While other creatures navigated through the gloom by touch or chemical scent, the trilobite was the first to master the physics of light, turning the dim bioluminescence of the abyss into a high-definition map of survival. The environment of the Ordovician Shelf was a world of shifting sediments and fluctuating temperatures, a place where the pressure of the water column acted as a constant, heavy blanket. The water was rich in dissolved calcite, and it was from this mineral abundance that the trilobite crafted its most miraculous feature. Unlike the soft organic lenses of our own eyes, the trilobite's eyes were made of solid crystal. They utilized inorganic, optical-grade calcite, the same mineral found in limestone, to focus light. This was a biological impossibility made real, a living creature that looked at the world through stones. These lenses were chemically pure, allowing light to pass through without distortion, even under the extreme pressures of the deep, providing a clarity of vision that would not be surpassed for hundreds of millions of years. The anatomy of these eyes, particularly in the suborder Phracopida, was a feat of sophisticated optics. They developed schizochroal eyes, consisting of large individual lenses separated by deep tissues. Each lens was a doublet, a complex structure designed to correct for spherical aberration, much like the high-end camera lenses manufactured by humans today. This allowed the trilobite to maintain a sharp focus on both near and distant objects simultaneously, a vital necessity in an environment where a predator like a giant cephalopod could appear from the darkness in an instant. Their nervous systems were highly specialized to process this crystalline data, integrating visual motion detection with the tactile input from their long, sensitive antennae. The trilobite did not just see the abyss, it calculated it. Beyond their vision, the biological mechanics of the trilobite body were a study in modular defense. Their segmented exoskeleton allowed them to roll into a tight, impenetrable ball of behavior known as enrollment, shielding their soft ventral organs and legs from attack. This was the first use of active armor in the animal kingdom. When enrolled, the trilobite became a geometric fortress of calcite, as indifferent to the world as the rocks it mimicked. Their respiratory systems consisted of delicate, gill-like structures attached to their legs, allowing them to extract oxygen even as they scuttled through the low-oxygen silts of the deep. They were the ultimate generalists, adapting to everything from the sunlit reefs to the lightless trenches. To contemplate the trilobite is to realize that life does not always require the new. Sometimes it only requires the perfect. They were the silent observers of the Paleozoic, their crystal eyes watching the rise and fall of empires until the very chemistry of the planet finally turned against them. The transition from the Cambrian dawn into the Ordovician marks a profound deepening of the world's oceans, a time when the waters grew colder and the shadows longer. To understand the Ordovician is to understand the first great expansion of the pelagic zone, the vast open water column that exists between the sunlit surface and the lightless floor. In this era, the Earth was a water world, with sea levels reaching heights that would submerge most of our modern continents. The atmosphere was heavy with carbon dioxide, and the climate was a humid greenhouse. But in the depths, a new kind of silence was taking hold. The pressure here was a living force, a crushing hand that demanded a new kind of biology, one capable of navigating a three-dimensional void without the comfort of the sea floor. The environment of the Ordovician deep was defined by the arrival of the first great reefs, though these were not the coral gardens we know today. They were massive, stony structures built by sponges and bryozoans, providing a vertical topography in an otherwise flat, silty world. The water chemistry was shifting. The calcite seas of the Ordovician were incredibly rich in minerals, allowing for the creation of massive heavy shells that would have been impossible in later eras. In this dense mineral-rich medium, gravity felt different. The high salinity and mineral content increased the buoyancy of life, allowing for the evolution of the first true giants of the open water. The sensory landscape was dominated by the low-frequency vibrations of massive bodies moving through the dark, a rhythmic displacement of water that signaled the presence of something vast and hungry. The biological mechanics of the Ordovician were centered on the perfection of the cephalopod, while the trilobites ruled the mud. The ancestors of the squid and octopus, the nautiloids, began to rule the water column. Their anatomy was a masterpiece of hydrostatic engineering. They developed long conical shells divided into internal chambers called camerae. By regulating the ratio of gas to liquid within these chambers via a tube of living tissue called the siphuncle, these creatures could achieve neutral buoyancy. They did not need to swim to stay afloat. They could simply hover, weightless and expectant, in the crushing dark. This was the first use of the submarine principle in nature, allowing a creature of soft flesh to carry a fortress of stone into the open sea. Supporting this buoyancy was a nervous system that was beginning to centralize, forming a complex brain encased in a protective cartilaginous capsule. Their eyes, though lacking the calcite lenses of the trilobite, were becoming more sophisticated, moving toward the pinhole camera model that allowed for better depth perception in the dim light. Their movement was powered by jet propulsion, forcing water through a muscular funnel to create bursts of speed. This combination of heavy armor, neutral buoyancy, and jet-powered agility made the Ordovician cephalopods the first true masters of the abyss. As we drift through this cold, deep era, we realize that the rules of engagement had changed. Life was no longer tethered to the earth. It had learned to haunt the void. The stage was set for the arrival of the first true leviathan, a creature that would stretch the limits of what a shell could be. The transition from the general rise of the cephalopods to the absolute dominance of a single lineage brings us face to face with the most formidable organism of the Ordovician, Cameroceras. To imagine this creature is to envision a living spear, a titanic nautiloid whose straight conical shell could reach lengths of nearly 6 meters. In an era where most life was measured in centimeters, Cameroceras was a biological impossibility, a mountain of calcium and muscle, drifting with terrifying grace through the abyssal currents. It was the apex of the straight-shelled nautiloids, a creature that transformed the crushing weight of the deep into a sanctuary for its immense, soft-bodied form. The environment inhabited by Cameroceras was one of perpetual twilight and staggering pressure. As it descended through the water column, the weight of the ocean pressed against its massive shell with a force that would have pulverized lesser organisms. Yet the internal architecture of Cameroceras was a masterclass in structural resilience. Its shell was not a hollow tube, but a series of reinforced chambers, each one meticulously engineered to withstand the hydrostatic stress of the deep. The water here was cold, slow-moving, and thick with the scent of frightened trilobites. The sensory profile of Cameroceras was dominated by its ability to detect the faintest chemical trails in the water, its tentacles trailing like spectral ribbons, feeling for the displacement of current that signaled the movement of prey. The biological mechanics of this leviathan centered on its sophisticated buoyancy control. Within its massive shell, the siphuncular strand of living tissue acted as a biological pump, adjusting the saline concentration within the abandoned chambers to regulate gas pressure. This allowed Cameroceras to hover motionless at specific depths, conserving energy while it waited for the shadows to move. Its mouth was a nightmare of evolutionary efficiency, featuring a powerful, parrot-like beak capable of snapping through the toughest trilobite carapaces. Surrounding this beak were powerful succulus tentacles, designed not for delicate manipulation, but for the brutal entanglement of struggling prey. Its eyes, though lacking a lens, functioned as advanced pinhole cameras, providing sharp enough resolution to track movement in the dim, bioluminescent glow of the Ordovician deep. The nervous system of Cameroceras was the most advanced of its time, featuring a centralized brain that coordinated the complex task of jet-propelled movement and predatory strikes. To move such a massive frame required immense muscular coordination. By contracting its mantle and forcing water through its hypernome, it could lunge forward with surprising speed, its long shell acting as a stabilizer in the high-viscosity brine. As we watch the 6-meter phantom drift silently through the darkness, we are forced to reflect on the nature of power in deep time. Cameroceras was a creature of absolute presence, a monarch of the void that required no eyes to be feared. Yet, its very specialization, the sheer scale of its mineralized fortress, made it vulnerable to a world that was beginning to change. The age of the giants was reaching its first great limit, and the abyss was preparing for a silence that not even a king could survive. The transition from the reign of the cephalopod kings into the late Ordovician brings us to the first great unraveling of the planetary tapestry. To witness the late Ordovician mass extinction is to observe the world grown cold and quiet, a slow-motion catastrophe that extinguished 85% of all species. This was not a sudden, explosive end, but a two-pulse descent into a frozen, hypoxic silence. The greenhouse world that had fostered the giants was replaced by the arrival of a continent-sized glacier at the South Pole, a crystalline predator that began to lock away the world's water, causing the sea levels to plummet and the shallow, sun-drenched shelves to vanish into the thin, dry air. The environment of this dying era was defined by a radical shift in oceanic circulation. As the glaciers of Gondwana grew, they pulled the warmth from the sea, creating a thermal shock that many species could not endure. The water is heavy, quiet and cavern-sill sea became stratified and stagnant. In the deep, the oxygen levels began to fail. The pressure remained, but the life-giving breath of the currents vanished, replaced by an encroaching anoxia that suffocated the benthic world. The sensory landscape was one of fading signals. The bioluminescence grew dim as populations thinned, and the once constant vibration of life scuttling across the silt was replaced by the eerie, muffled sound of drifting ice and the settling of organic decay. The biological mechanics of this collapse were centered on the loss of habitat. The trilobites, once the masters of the shelf, found their world shrinking as the shoreline retreated by hundreds of miles. Their anatomy, so perfectly tuned for specific depths and pressures, became their undoing. They could not migrate fast enough to escape the cooling waters or the disappearing shallows. We see the collapse of the great brachiopod forests and the crumbling of the bryozoan reefs as the chemistry of the water turned increasingly acidic and oxygen poor. The nervous systems of these creatures, designed to detect predators and prey, were now overwhelmed by the chemical stress of a suffocating ocean. The extinction pulse was a lesson in the limits of specialization. As we drift through the chilling waters of the late Ordovician, we are reminded of the fragility of even the most established empires. The great Cameroceras, once the undisputed monarch of the abyss, vanished as its food sources disintegrated and its massive, mineral-heavy shell became a burden in a rapidly changing world. This was the first time the Earth reset the clock, thinning the ranks of the complex to make room for the survivors. To contemplate this extinction is to recognize that stability is an illusion maintained by the grace of climate and chemistry. The abyss was not destroyed, but it was emptied, waiting in the cold, dark silence for a new lineage to rise from the wreckage and claim the Silurian dawn. The transition from the frozen silence of the Ordovician into the Silurian period marks a spectacular chemical and biological rebirth. To observe the Silurian recovery is to watch a planet heal itself through the patient, rhythmic application of heat and time. As the great glaciers of Gondwana began to melt, the world's oceans surged back onto the continental shelves, creating vast, shallow epicontinental seas that acted as the nurseries of modern life. The atmosphere, once choked with volcanic carbon, began to stabilize, and for the first time the deep ocean began to breathe again. The stagnant, anoxic basins of the extinction era were flushed with fresh, oxygenated currents, igniting a biological renaissance that would move away from the heavy armor of the past toward a new, fluid agility. The environment of the Silurian was a world of shimmering, crystalline clarity. The water chemistry shifted as the calcite seas began to transition, and the temperature of the abyss stabilized into a cool, predictable embrace. In the shallow zones, the first true coral reefs began to rise massive, skeletal cathedrals built by tabulate and rugose corals that provided a three-dimensional complexity never before seen. The sensory landscape was becoming increasingly crowded. The silence was now punctuated by the clicks and scrapes of 1,000 new crustacean lineages and the low, percussive thrum of the first jawed fish. The pressure of the deep was no longer a tomb, but a playground for a new kind of experimental anatomy that favored speed over sheer thickness. The biological mechanics of the Silurian were dominated by a revolutionary architectural shift, the evolution of the jaw. In the preceding eras, fish were largely jawless, filter-feeding organisms known as ostracoderms, encased in heavy bony plates. But in the Silurian, the first branchial arches, the supports for the gills began to migrate and transform into articulated mandibles. This was the birth of the acanthodians, or spiny sharks. Their anatomy was a masterpiece of streamlining, featuring multiple pairs of fins supported by rigid spines, which allowed for a level of maneuverability that made the old, straight-shelled cephalopods look like drifting logs. Their nervous systems were rapidly evolving to support this new mobility, with enlarged cerebellums to coordinate complex swimming patterns and lateral line systems that could detect the heartbeat of a hidden predator through the vibration of the water molecules themselves. This era also saw the refinement of internal skeletonization. While the giants of the past carried their fortresses on the outside, the new masters of the Silurian were moving their support structures inward. This allowed for larger muscle attachments and more explosive power, turning the fish from passive drifters into active pursuers. As we drift through the Silurian dawn, we see a world that is becoming recognizable. A world where the struggle for survival is no longer a slow-motion grind, but a high-speed ballet of bone and muscle. The Abyss was once again a place of ambition, and the stage was set for the arrival of a new kind of terror, one that would crawl from the silty shadows to challenge the very definition of a monster. The transition from the fluid agility of the spiny sharks leads us back to the heavy, silt-choked floor of the Silurian estuaries, where a different kind of nightmare was assembling itself. To encounter Pterygotus is to witness the absolute zenith of the Eurypterids, the sea scorpions that reigned as the largest arthropods to ever inhabit the planet's oceans. Measuring over 2 meters in length, these were the heavy armored tanks of the Brachistid, creatures that bridged the gap between the ancient chitinous world of the Cambrian and the sophisticated vertebrate-led future. They were the masters of the ambush, silent sentinels buried in the substrate, waiting for the vibration of a passing fish to trigger a mechanical strike of terrifying speed. The environment of the Silurian sea scorpion was a world of shifting tides and high-viscosity mud. The water was often clouded with organic sediment, reducing visibility to mere centimeters and favoring those who could see through the pressure of the surrounding brine. Pterygotus inhabited the transitional zones, the estuaries and coastal lagoons where the salinity fluctuated and the pressure was manageable but constant. The sensory profile of this realm was defined by the rhythmic ebb and flow of the tide, which brought with it a constant stream of nutrients and a revolving door of prey. For Pterygotus, the abyss was not a lightless void, but a tactile landscape, a series of vibrations and conical scents processed through its sensitive, jointed appendages. The anatomy of Pterygotus was a study in specialized predatory hardware. Its most formidable tools were its chelica, a pair of massive pincer-like appendages at the front of its body lined with sharp serrated teeth. These were not merely for grasping. They were designed to crush and puncture the bony armor of early fish. Unlike modern scorpions, Pterygotus possessed a paddle-like tail, or telson, and flattened rear legs that functioned as oars, allowing it to move with surprising bursts of speed across the sea floor. Its body was encased in a segmented, semi-flexible exoskeleton that provided a perfect balance between protection and mobility. Its nervous system featured large, compound eyes with a high density of ommatidia, giving it a wide field of view even in the murky, low-light conditions of the Silurian shelf. The biological mechanics of the Eurypterid were uniquely adapted to their environment through the use of book gills, sets of leaf-like respiratory structures, located on the underside of the abdomen. These gills were highly efficient at extracting oxygen from the water, but their structure suggests a fascinating evolutionary possibility: the ability to survive brief periods of exposure to the air, foreshadowing the eventual migration of life onto land. The internal pressure of the creature was maintained by a sophisticated circulatory system that pumped hemolymph through its massive frame, supporting its heavy musculature. As we watch Pterygotus scuttle into the shadows of a Silurian reef, we see a creature that represents the ultimate expression of the arthropod body plan. It was a king of the mud, a titan of the tide, reminding us that even in the age of fish, the ancient lineages of the armored deep refused to yield their crown without a fight. The transition into the Devonian period, approximately 419 million years ago, marks the most significant expansion of vertebrate life in the history of the deep. To enter the Devonian is to witness the age of fishes, a time when the oceanic void was no longer a silent gallery of drifting invertebrates, but a roaring engine of biological innovation. This was the era when the fundamental architecture of the modern world, bone, teeth and complex fins, was perfected in the crushing pressure of the abyss. The Earth's climate had stabilized into a warm, humid equilibrium, and the oceans reached a peak of nutrient density, fueling an evolutionary frenzy that would produce some of the most specialized and terrifying organisms to ever haunt the water column. The environment of the Devonian deep was a realm of increasing verticality. The rise of massive reef systems, now dominated by scleractinian precursors and enormous glass sponges, created a complex topography that extended from the sunlit surface down into the bathyal zones. The water was rich in phosphates and nitrates, supporting a massive base of planktonic life that served as the high-octane fuel for the vertebrate explosion. The sensory landscape was now dominated by the lateral line, a sophisticated distant touch system that allowed fish to detect the pressure waves of a predator's movement from hundreds of meters away. The abyss was becoming a crowded, noisy theater of pursuit and evasion, where the thickness of the water served as both a shield and a medium for the transmission of lethal vibrations. The biological mechanics of the Devonian were centered on the rise of two great lineages, the Actinopterygii, or ray-finned fish, and the Sarcopterygii, or lobe-finned fish, and the Sarcopterygii, the lobe-finned fish. The lobe-finned fish were particularly revolutionary. Their anatomy featured fleshy, muscular fins supported by a central bone structure that is the direct ancestor of the human humerus, radius, and ulna. These were not merely paddles, but powerful levers capable of navigating the high viscosity currents of the deep and the cluttered environments of the reef. Their respiratory systems were equally advanced, with some species developing primitive lung-like sacs that allowed them to survive in lower oxygen basins. The nervous systems of these Devonian pioneers were rapidly centralizing, with enlarged optic lobes and olfactory bulbs, turning the fish into a high-precision sensory platform capable of complex social behaviors and strategic hunting. Supporting this new mobility was the perfection of the dermal bone. While the Silurian fish were often covered in heavy, inflexible plates, the Devonian masters evolved lighter, more flexible scales that provided protection without sacrificing speed. This was the era of the placoderm armored giants that wore a helmet of bone, while the rest of their body remained sleek and agile. As we drift through the Devonian gloom, we see the first glimpses of a world we recognize, a world of schools, of territories, and of apex predators that no longer relied on shells for survival. The deep time was moving toward a moment of ultimate power, where the jaw would become a weapon of mass destruction. We are standing on the threshold of the reign of the armored kings, where a single bite could reshape the destiny of a lineage. The transition from the general rise of the Devonian fish leads us to the absolute pinnacle of prehistoric aquatic power. To understand the Devonian is to confront the terrifying reality of Dunkleosteus tyrrelli, the undisputed monarch of the Arphixdeus tyrrelli, the undisputed monarch of the armored deep. If the preceding eras were defined by the slow grinding defense of the shell, Dunkleosteus was the birth of the kinetic strike. Measuring nearly 10 meters in length and weighing over 4 tons, this placoderm was a living fortress of bone and muscle. It represented the ultimate expression of the head shield, architecture, a creature that had traded the heavy, full-body armor of its ancestors for a concentrated, impenetrable helmet, leaving its rear body flexible for the explosive bursts of speed required of an apex predator. The environment of the late Devonian was a world of high-stakes atmospheric and oceanic change. As the first forests began to colonize the land, they leached massive amounts of nutrients into the sea, fueling giant algae blooms that often left the deep basins hypoxic. In this oxygen-poor, lightless void, Dunkleosteus reigned supreme. The water here was a dense, pressing medium that the giant navigated using its massive pectoral fins, which functioned like the wings of a heavy aircraft. The sensory landscape was a map of pressure. Dunkleosteus possessed a highly developed lateral line system embedded within its bony plates, allowing it to sense the rhythmic displacement of water caused by the frantic movements of smaller prey. The crushing pressure of the abyss was irrelevant to a creature whose skull was composed of solid, interlocking plates of dermal bone. The anatomy of Dunkleosteus was a masterclass in biomechanical destruction. It did not possess teeth in the traditional sense. Instead, its jaws were equipped with massive self-sharpening bony plates. These plates functioned like a pair of industrial shears, sliding past one another to maintain a razor-sharp edge. The mechanics of its bite were revolutionary, utilizing a 4-bar linkage system. Dunkleosteus could open its mouth in just 20 milliseconds, creating a powerful vacuum that sucked prey into its maw. Once the jaws closed, they struck with a force of 6,000 newtons at the tip, enough to puncture the toughest armor of the era. This was the first time in history that a predator could crush almost any material the natural world could produce. Its nervous system was centered around a sophisticated brain capable of coordinating this complex high-speed strike while navigating the darkness. Supporting this lethality was a highly efficient respiratory system. Dunkleosteus possessed large gill chambers protected by its thoracic armor, allowing it to maintain its massive metabolic needs even in the oxygen-depleted waters of the Lake Devonian. Its eyes were protected by sclerotic rings bony inserts within the eyeball that prevented the high pressure of the deep and the mechanical stress of its own bite from deforming its vision. As we watch this armored titan drift through the obsidian waters, we are witnessing the end of an era. Dunkleosteus was a specialized machine of war, a creature of such overwhelming power that it seemed invincible. Yet, the very armor that made it a king would become its legacy. A stone-cold reminder that even the most formidable hunters are bound by the shifting chemistry of a world they cannot control. The transition from the violent reign of the armored placoderms leads us away from the open water column and back toward the intricate swaying architecture of the Devonian sea floor. To witness the forests in the water is to see the abyss transformed into a vertical labyrinth of life. While the predators above fought a war of speed and bone, the floor of the deep shelf was being colonized by a different kind of titan. These were the crinoid meadows vast, dense thickets of echinoderms known as sea lilies, which stretched their feathered arms into the currents. Though they resembled plants, these were animals of profound complexity, creating a biological infrastructure that supported a hidden world of micro-predators and symbiotic scavengers in the eternal, mineral-rich gloom. The environment of a Devonian crinoid forest was a realm of muffled sound and high-frequency vibration. The water was thick with marine snow, a constant rain of organic detritus from the life-rich layers above. In this nutrient-dense slurry, the crinoids thrived by transforming the crushing pressure of the deep into a structural advantage. Their bodies were composed of thousands of individual calcite discs, or columns, stacked like a biological spine and held together by specialized ligaments that could lock into place without the expenditure of muscular energy. The sensory profile of this forest was dominated by the rhythmic swaying of millions of stalks, a tactile symphony that the inhabitants used to navigate. The pressure here was a stabilizing force, pressing the calcite plates together and allowing the lilies to reach heights of several meters without collapsing under their own weight. The anatomy of these crinoids was a masterpiece of filter-feeding engineering. At the top of each stalk sat the calyx, a cup-like structure containing the vital organs, from which branched a series of feathery arms lined with tiny mucus-covered tube feet. These feet, or podia, were governed by a sophisticated water-vascular system, a hydraulic network that used the pressure of the surrounding sea to move and capture food particles. This was the first great biological filter, a massive living sieve that processed the chemistry of the ocean with hypnotic efficiency. Within the stalks and arms of these forests lived a diverse array of organisms, including small specialized trilobites and early brittle stars, which evolved to mimic the texture and color of the crinoids, creating a world of spectral camouflage in the deep. The nervous system of the crinoid was decentralized, a ring-like structure that allowed each arm to respond independently to the flow of the current or the touch of a predator. This lack of a central brain was not a disadvantage but a strategy for immortality. A crinoid could lose most of its arms to a passing fish and simply regenerate them, a slow and silent resilience that allowed the forests persist for millions of years. As we drift through these calcified glades, we realize that the abyss is not merely a place of death and pursuit, but a place of profound cooperation and architectural beauty. The crinoid meadows were the first true cities of the deep, providing the oxygen and stability that would eventually allow life to dream of a world beyond the water. But as the Devonian progressed, the very success of these underwater forests began to trigger a shift in the planet's pulse, leading us toward a threshold that would change the nature of breath forever. The transition from the fluid, submerged labyrinth of the crinoid forests brings us to the most consequential threshold in the history of the vertebrate lineage. To witness the emergence of the first tetrapodomorphs is to watch the slow, agonizing birth of the terrestrial world. For over 3 billion years, the abyss was the only theatre of existence, but in the late Devonian, the water began to surrender its monopoly. We turn our focus to Tiktaalik rose-eye, a creature that exists in the sensory dissonance between the crushing weight of the sea and the thin, alien atmosphere of the land. It was not a creature of the open abyss, but a product of its margins, a pioneer that carried the lessons of the deep into the shimmering, unstable shallows of the first coastal swamps. The environment of the Devonian transition was a realm of brackish uncertainty. The water was shallow, choked with the rotting remnants of the first land plants and depleted of oxygen. In these stagnant pools, the high-pressure efficiency of the deep-sea gill was a liability. The sensory landscape was a chaotic mix of aquatic vibrations and the first muffled sounds of wind and rain. The water chemistry was heavy with tannins and organic acids, creating a murky, low-visibility world where light was a fractured, dappled ghost. For Tiktaalik, survival depended on a radical recalibration of the senses. The lateral line, so vital in the open ocean, began to share its duties with the first primitive ears, designed to catch the low-frequency vibrations of a world that was no longer entirely liquid. The biological mechanics of Tiktaalik were a masterpiece of intermediate engineering. Its most revolutionary feature was the anatomy of its pectoral fins. Unlike the delicate rays of the actinopterygian fish, Tiktaalik possessed a robust internal bone structure, humerus, radius and ulna wrapped in thick, powerful muscle. These were the first proto-limbs capable of supporting the creature's weight against the pull of gravity in shallow water. Its neck was another evolutionary milestone. Unlike all fish that preceded it, Tiktaalik had a skull that was not fused to its shoulder girdle. This allowed for an independent, rhythmic movement of the head, a necessity for a predator that needed to look around a three-dimensional environment that was increasingly horizontal rather than vertical. Supporting this structural shift was a dual-mode respiratory system. While it retained gills for the water, Tiktaalik also possessed a primitive lung, a modified gas bladder, that allowed it to gulp air from the surface when the surrounding water became too hypoxic to sustain life. Its eyes were positioned on the top of its flat crocodile-like head, optimized for peering across the water-land interface into a world of unchecked light. The nervous system was undergoing a profound reorganization, with the forebrain expanding to process the complex spatial data of a landscape that included obstacles, shorelines, and the first land-dwelling invertebrates. As we watch this ancestor drag its heavy, wet frame through the Devonian silt, we are forced to reflect on the nature of ambition. Tiktaalik was not leaving the water by choice, but by necessity, fleeing the crowded, predatory abyss for a world of untapped potential. It carried within its fins the blueprint for every wing, every hand, and every foot that would ever walk the earth. The deep time was no longer confined to the depths. It was beginning to climb. We stand now at the end of the age of fishes, looking out over the humid, oxygen-rich horizons of the Carboniferous, where the silence of the abyss would be replaced by the first great roar of the land. The transition from the shifting margins of the Devonian into the Carboniferous period, approximately 359 million years ago, marks a transformation of the planetary atmosphere into a heavy, hyper-oxygenated shroud. To enter the Carboniferous is to step into a world of intoxicating density, where the oxygen levels surged to an incredible 35%, nearly double the concentration of our modern air. This was the era of the coal forests, a time when the Earth was smothered in a humid, global jungle of giant lycopsids and horsetails. But beneath the canopy, in the lightless basins and the flooded coastal plains, the abyss had followed the land, creating a new kind of darkness. The water was no longer a mineral-rich brine, but a tea-colored, acidic medium, thick with the tannins of 1,000 fallen forests and the low-frequency hum of a world that was becoming dangerously alive. The environment of the Carboniferous darkness was defined by its overwhelming viscosity and chemical weight. The sheer volume of decaying plant matter in the water created a landscape of black water swamps and stagnant coastal trenches. Here, the crushing pressure of the deep sea was replaced by a different kind of burden, the suffocating density of the organic muck. The water chemistry was volatile. As the massive trees died and sank, they stripped the oxygen from the lower strata, creating vast, anoxic death zones where only the most specialized could survive. The sensory landscape was a chaotic tapestry of chemical signals. The smell of rot, the taste of methane, and the constant heavy vibration of the Earth's crust fueled by the collision of continents forming the supercontinent Pangaea created a world that felt thick, tangible, and profoundly indifferent to the light. The biological mechanics of the Carboniferous were a response to this atmospheric and aquatic excess. The high oxygen levels allowed for a radical scaling up of the invertebrate body plan, because insects and arthropods rely on passive diffusion through tiny tubes called tracheae. Their size is limited by the density of oxygen in the air. In the Carboniferous, those limits were shattered. We see the emergence of the Pulmonus scorpius, a giant terrestrial scorpion the size of a dog, and the first massive amphibians that navigated the flooded forests like living logs. Their anatomy was optimized for the high-pressure humidity, with thick glandular skin designed to prevent desiccation while allowing for cutaneous respiration breathing through the skin to supplement their primitive lungs. The nervous systems of these Carboniferous dwellers were becoming highly attuned to the specialized vibrations of the forest. The amphibians developed a sophisticated middle ear to process the sounds of the humid air, while their lateral lines remained active for their time in the water. This dual-mode existence required a complex neural integration, a bridge between the aquatic and the terrestrial that forced the brain to expand and specialize. The eyes of these creatures were often large and upward-facing, designed to peer through the tannin-stained waters toward the silhouette of a giant dragonfly or a predatory tetrapod. As we drift through the humid obsidian silence of a Carboniferous night, we realize that the abyss has been reinvented. It is no longer found only in the trenches of the ocean, but in the dense, lightless heart of the forest. The world was a giant, breathing engine of growth and decay, a place where life was being pushed to its mechanical limits by the very air it breathed. We are moving toward a threshold where the small will become giants, and the crawl of the tetrapod will become a stride. The darkness was no longer just a place to hide. It was a place to grow into something monstrous. The transition into the high canopy world of the Carboniferous brings us to a revolution in the physics of life. To understand this era, one must look upward, away from the silty floor and into the thick, hyperoxygenated air that had become as dense as a shallow sea. The atmosphere was no longer a void, but a fluid medium capable of supporting a new kind of apex predator. We encounter Meganeura monyi, a giant griffin flea with a wingspan exceeding 70 centimeters. In our modern world of thin air, such a creature is a biological impossibility, its respiratory system incapable of fueling a body of that scale. But in the Carboniferous, the atmosphere was a high-octane fuel, and Meganeura was its most elegant engine. The environment of the upper Carboniferous canopy was a realm of dizzying verticality and relentless humidity. The air was so saturated with oxygen and moisture that it possessed a tactile quality, a viscosity that felt more like liquid than gas. For a creature like Meganeura, this density was a structural gift. It allowed for the generation of immense lift with every stroke of its 4 independent wings. The sensory landscape of the sky was a map of thermal updrafts and the chemical pheromones of the forest below. The silence of the deep time was now broken by the low-frequency, percussive thrum of wingser sound that would have vibrated through the very ribs of any creature watching from the shadows. To be in the presence of Meganeura was to feel the air itself pulse with the mechanical effort of a predator that had claimed the third dimension. The anatomy of Meganeura was a masterpiece of lightweight, high-tensile engineering. Its wings were not merely membranes, but complex lattices of chitinous veins that provided both rigidity and flexibility. These veins doubled as a respiratory network, allowing oxygen to diffuse directly into the flight muscles at a rate that would be impossible in our own time. The mechanics of its flight were governed by a direct muscular attachment to the wing base, allowing it to hover, dive, and change direction with the precision of a modern interceptor drone. Its eyes were perhaps its most terrifying feature. 2 massive hemispherical compound structures that covered most of its head, containing over 30,000 individual ommatidia. This provided a panoramic, high-speed visual field, allowing it to track the erratic movements of smaller insects against the dappled light of the giant lycopsid trees. The nervous system of this aerial titan was optimized for reaction time. The optic lobes dominated its brain, processing visual data at a speed that rendered the world in slow motion. Its legs were tucked beneath its thorax, lined with sharp inward curving spines that formed a prey basket. It did not kill with a jaw, but by snagging its victims mid-air and dismantling them with powerful mandibles while still on the wing. The biological mechanics of Magonura represent a moment when the invertebrate body plan reached its absolute limit of power and scale. It was a specialist of the oxygen peak, a creature whose existence was tied directly to the chemical excess of its era. As we watch this spectral hunter glide through the green twilight of the coal forests, we are forced to reflect on the fragility of greatness. Magonura was a king of the air, yet it was a prisoner of the atmosphere that created it. As the oxygen levels would eventually fluctuate and fall, the giant would vanish, leaving behind only the smaller, humbler kin we know today. The abyss of the sky was just as unforgiving as the abyss of the sea. We turn our gaze now back to the forest floor, where another giant was moving through the leaf litter, a creature that traded the grace of flight for the crushing power of 1,000 legs. The transition from the aerial dominance of the high canopy leads us back to the humid, subterranean gloom of the forest floor, where the crushing weight of the carboniferous atmosphere fueled a different kind of giant. To encounter Arthroplura is to witness the absolute limit of the terrestrial invertebrate. Measuring up to 2.5 meters in length and nearly half a meter wide, this titanic relative of the modern millipede was a biological tank, a rolling carpet of chitin and muscle that haunted the lightless undergrowth. In our own time, we view the world of the small as a realm of fragility, but on the floor of the coal forest, the small had become the monumental. Arthroplura was not a creature of speed, but of unstoppable momentum, a slow-moving mountain of segmented armor that lived in the rhythmic, percussive silence of the leaf litter. The environment of the deep forest floor was a sensory landscape of decay and high-density vibration. The air here was even thicker than in the canopy, trapped by the towering trunks of lepidodendron and sigillaria, and heavy with the scent of stagnant water and mouldering cellulose. The ground was not solid earth, but a deep, spongy mattress of organic debris, several meters thick, which acted as a resonant drum for every movement. For Arthroplura, the abyss was a world of tactile topography. It navigated through the dark using its long, sensitive antennae to map the chemical and physical contours of the forest, while its numerous legs felt the micro-vibrations of the Earth's crust. The pressure of the oxygen-rich air allowed its massive frame to remain light enough to move, even as its internal organs were supported by a sophisticated hydrostatic pressure system. The anatomy of Arthroplura was a marvel of modular engineering. Its body was composed of approximately 30 overlapping plates or tergites, which provided a perfect balance between impenetrable defense and fluid flexibility. Beneath this armor, nearly 100 pairs of jointed legs moved in a metronomic wave-like sequence, a process known as metachronal rhythm. This allowed the creature to distribute its considerable weight across a wide surface area, preventing it from sinking into the soft, swampy ground. The biological mechanics of its movement were surprisingly efficient. By coordinating the firing of its leg muscles in a rhythmic pulse, it could glide over obstacles with a smoothness that belied its massive size. Its respiratory system was a high-capacity network of tracheae, pulling the 35% oxygen directly into its tissues to fuel the metabolic demands of its gargantuan musculature. The nervous system of this multi-legged titan was decentralized, featuring a chain of ganglia small mini-brains running the length of its body. This allowed for instantaneous coordination of its limbs without the lag of a centralized signal, making its movement look like a liquid flowing over the roots of the forest. Its mouthparts were designed for the heavy work of dismantling tough plant matter or scavenging the remains of fallen tetrapods, featuring powerful mandibles that could grind through the fibrous tissues of carboniferous vegetation. Its eyes reduced, as vision was a luxury in the permanent twilight of the undergrowth. Instead, it relied on a sophisticated sense of proprioception, the internal awareness of its own body position, to navigate the complex geometry of the forest floor. As we watch this armored phantom ripple through the ferns, we are reminded of the indifference of deep time. Arthroplura was a creature born of excess, a specialist of a high-pressure, high-oxygen world that could not last forever. It moved with the confidence of an apex dweller, yet its reign was tethered to the very forests it consumed. As the climate began to dry and the oxygen levels began their long, slow retreat, the giants of the leaf litter would find themselves trapped in bodies that the world could no longer sustain. We turn now toward the Permian, where the lush jungles would wither into dust, and a new kind of survivor would rise to claim the drying abyss. The transition from the humid, oxygen-soaked jungles of the Carboniferous into the Permian period marks a profound and chilling shift in the Earth's pulse. Approximately 298 million years ago, the atmospheric engine that had fueled the giants of the air and forest floor began to sputter. The globe was drying. The sprawling, stagnant swamps were receding, replaced by a vast arid interior as the supercontinent Pangaea reached its peak. To witness the Permian transition is to watch the world lose its moisture. The thick emerald shroud of the coal forests withering into a landscape of dust and seasonal extremes. The abyss was no longer a realm of liquid tea and rotting cellulose. It was becoming a world of salt pans and baking heat, where the crushing pressure of the atmosphere was replaced by the relentless, desiccating gaze of a more powerful sun. The environment of the early Permian was defined by a sensory profile of sharpening contrasts. The air, while still richer in oxygen than our own, was losing its heavy viscosity, becoming thin and transparent. The silence of the deep was replaced by the howl of transcontinental winds, carrying the scent of gymnosperms and parched earth. In the shrinking basins, the water chemistry became increasingly saline, creating a brine abyss where life had to endure osmotic pressures that would have shriveled the soft-bodied pioneers of the Devonian. The rhythmic vibration of the Carboniferous was gone, replaced by the stillness of the desert. For the inhabitants of this era, survival was no longer about managing excess, but about the conservation of the most precious chemical of all, water. The biological mechanics of the Permian were dominated by the rise of the synapsids, the lineage of the single arch. These were our own distant ancestors, creatures that began the long morphological journey toward the mammalian form. Their anatomy represented a radical departure from the amphibious masters of the swamp. To survive the drying world, they developed a thickened, glandular skin and the amniotic egg, a biological fortress that allowed life to carry its own private abyss of fluid into the dry interior. This was a revolutionary milestone in hydrostatic engineering. The egg was a self-contained life support system, shielding the embryo from the external pressure of a dehydrating world. The skeletal structure of these early synapsids, such as the Paleozoic, moved toward a more vertical orientation, allowing for more efficient locomotion across the hard, sun-baked Earth. Supporting this transition was a nervous system that was becoming increasingly integrated with the demands of a high-temperature environment. The Permian saw the refinement of the pineal third eye that sensed changes in light and temperature, helping these creatures regulate their metabolic cycles in a world of harsh seasonal shifts. Their teeth were no longer uniform but began to differentiate into specialized tools for tearing and grinding, a prerequisite for the high-energy demands of a more active lifestyle. This was the birth of the metabolic race, where the chemistry of the body had to work harder to maintain stability against an indifferent climate. As we watched the first synapsids traverse the shifting dunes of the Permian, we realized that the abyss has moved inward. It is no longer a place we inhabit, but a place we carry within us, a liquid legacy protected by skin and bone. The world was becoming a theater of endurance, where only those who could master the heat would prevail. We turn now to the most iconic of these early masters, a creature that wore its thermal strategy like a sail against the wind, drifting through the Permian heat with a predatory grace that hinted at the empires to come. The transition into the mid-Permian brings us to a masterpiece of thermodynamic engineering, a creature that has become the visual shorthand for the ancient world's resilience. To gaze upon Dimetrodon grandis is to witness the first great experiment in surface area architecture, although often mistaken for a dinosaur. This synapsid was a closer relative to the ancestors of humanity than to any reptile of the Mesozoic. It was a creature of the arid plains and the drying riparian corridors, a 3-meter-long predator that dominated the landscape through a radical application of heat exchange. In the Permian, where the temperature could swing with lethal velocity between the freezing nights and the scorching days, the Dimetrodon did not merely survive the climate, it harnessed it. The environment of the Permian interior was a realm of thermal extremes and atmospheric clarity. The water was scarce, found only in the deep, slow-moving rivers that cut through the redbed sediments. The air was dry and carried the sharp, resinous scent of early conifers, a far cry from the humid, muffled silence of the Carboniferous. The sensory landscape was defined by the glare of the sun and the long shifting shadows of the scrubland. For Dimetrodon, the abyss was no longer a liquid weight but a thermal one, the constant, pressing burden of energy regulation. The ground beneath its feet was hard and dusty, vibrating with the movement of scuttling parareptiles and the heavy rhythmic gait of rival synapsids. The anatomy of Dimetrodon was defined by its spectacular neural spine sail, a structure formed by the staggering elongation of its vertebrae. These spines were draped in a thin, highly vascularized skin, creating a biological radiator of unparalleled efficiency. By orienting its body toward the morning sun, Dimetrodon could flush its sail with blood, warming its core temperature much faster than its competitors or its prey. This allowed it to reach peak metabolic activity while other creatures were still sluggish from the night's chill. Conversely, in the heat of the noon sun, it could turn its sail into the wind to shed excess heat. This was the first smart, thermal system of the deep time, a way to maintain a steady internal chemistry in a world that was becoming increasingly volatile. Supporting this thermal advantage was a nervous system and dental array that marked the birth of the strategic predator. Dimetrodon was one of the first creatures to possess truly differentiated teeth. The name itself means two-measure tooth. It featured large, stabbing canines for the kill and smaller shearing teeth for processing flesh, a mechanical refinement that allowed for a much higher caloric intake. Its skull was deep and robust, housing powerful jaw muscles that could deliver a crushing bite, while its eyes, protected by bony rings, were optimized for the high-contrast light of the Permian day. Its gait was a sprawling one, but its bone density and muscle attachments suggest a creature capable of sudden, explosive lunges, fueled by the energy gathered in its sail. As we watched this sail-backed titan drift through the shimmering heat haze of the Permian, we realized that life was learning to master the invisible forces of the atmosphere. Dimetrodon was a specialist of the light, a creature that used the sun itself as a tool for dominance. But as the Permian progressed, the climate would continue to sharpen its edge, moving away from the Paleozoics toward more advanced mammalian-like predators that would internalize their heat and refine their stride. The sail would eventually disappear, replaced by more hidden, more efficient metabolism, as the world prepared for the arrival of the most terrifying hunters the Paleozoic would ever produce. The transition from the thermal experimentation of the sail-backed Paleozoics leads us into the late Permian, a period where the ancestral mammalian line began to shed its reptilian skin. To encounter a gorgonopsid, such as Inostransphia, is to witness the birth of the mammalian stride and the invention of the saber-tooth. These were the gorgon faces, the dominant predators of the Pangaean interior, creatures that stood at the apex of a world that was becoming increasingly brutal and desiccated. Measuring nearly 4 meters in length, with a skull built like an obsidian sledgehammer, the gorgonopsidian was the first organism to combine the stamina of a hunter with the mechanical precision of a specialized killer. It was no longer a sprawling drifter. It was a focused, warm-blooded phantom. The environment of the late Permian was a sensory landscape of harsh, metallic light and the constant, abrasive scent of dust and scrub. The air was dry, and the vast river systems of the previous era had dwindled into seasonal wadis, leaving behind salt crusts that crunched beneath the weight of heavy-footed herbivores. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low, guttural breathing of these synapsid titans and the occasional sharp crack of a dry branch. For a gorgonopsid, the abyss was a tactical one, the long, empty spaces between the few remaining waterholes where prey would eventually be forced to gather. The vibration of the earth was now a source of data. Their limbs were tucked more directly beneath their bodies than their ancestors, allowing for a more efficient, rhythmic gait that could cover hundreds of miles in pursuit of a scent. The anatomy of the gorgonopsid was a masterclass in specialized violence. Its most striking feature was its massive, blade-like upper canines, which could reach lengths of 15 centimeters. These were not merely for display. The skull was engineered with a radical jaw hinge that allowed the mouth to gape to an angle of over 90 degrees, a biological necessity to clear the length of the teeth for a strike. The mechanics of the kill were focused on the soft tissues of the throat or the belly of armored prey like the Cameroceras. Supporting this weaponry was a highly advanced nervous system. The gorgonopsid brain possessed enlarged olfactory bulbs and a sophisticated inner ear, suggesting a predator that hunted by scent and possessed a keen sense of balance, a prerequisite for the high-speed maneuvers required to take down large, struggling victims. The biological mechanics of these creatures also hint at the first stirrings of endothermy, or warm-bloodedness. Their bone histology suggests a rapid growth rate and high metabolic demand, requiring a constant intake of calories to fuel their active hunting style. Their skin was likely becoming more glandular, possibly even harboring the first ancestral traces of fur to regulate heat during the frigid Permian nights. This internalization of the abyss, the ability to maintain a constant internal environment regardless of the external chaos, was the ultimate evolutionary gamble. It made them the most successful predators of their time, but it also made them vulnerable to the coming collapse. Their high-energy lifestyle required a world of abundance, a world that was about to be systematically dismantled by the very earth beneath their feet. As we watch a gorgonopsid stand motionless over the parched red earth, its saber teeth glinting in the dying light of the Permian sun, we are witnessing the end of a lineage's golden age. They were the perfection of the synapsid form, the ancestors of our own kind, ruling a world that felt permanent in its dry, windswept majesty. Yet, deep within the Siberian crust, a pressure was building that no amount of predatory skill could overcome. The Great Dying was approaching, a chemical apocalypse that would turn the atmosphere into a tomb and the oceans into a stagnant, boiling broth. The reign of the Gorgons was about to be silenced by the fire. This transition from the reign of the Gorgonopsids into the terminal phase of the Permian marks the beginning of the most profound biological collapse in the history of the Earth. To witness the onset of the Great Dying is to watch the planetary life support system fail in real time. This was not the sudden, localized violence of an asteroid, but a slow, systemic poisoning of the world, triggered by the eruption of the Siberian traps. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Earth's crust split open, spewing millions of cubic kilometers of basaltic lava across a landscape the size of a continent. But it was not the fire that killed the world, it was the breath of the fire. The eruptions released staggering quantities of carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur dioxide, turning the atmosphere into a heavy, caustic veil that began to trap the sun's heat with a terrifying runaway efficiency. The environment of the initial extinction pulse was defined by a sensory profile of chemical oppression and oppressive heat. The air, once dry and clear, became a thick yellowish haze of volcanic aerosols and greenhouse gases. The smell of the world changed. The resinous scent of the Permian scrub was replaced by the acrid, metallic tang of sulfur and the sweet, sickly odor of global decay. The sensory landscape was one of mounting silence. The great migrations of the synapsids ceased as the waterholes turned to toxic brine and the vegetation withered under a sun that had become a searing ultraviolet enemy. For the inhabitants of the Pangean interior, the abyss was no longer a place of shadow, but a world of blinding, inescapable heat that reached 50 degrees Celsius even in the higher latitudes. The biological mechanics of this first phase were centered on the failure of thermoregulation and the collapse of the food chain. The Gorgonopsids, with their high metabolic demands and specialized predatory needs, were among the first to falter. Their anatomy, designed for the pursuit of large herbivores, became a liability as their prey vanished. The nervous systems of these titans, once tuned to the subtle vibrations of the hunt, were now overwhelmed by the physiological stress of hypercapnia carbon dioxide poisoning. As the CO2 levels soared, the blood of the synapsids became increasingly acidic, leading to a slow systemic failure of the heart and brain. We see the desperate final movements of these creatures as they sought refuge in the shrinking shadows, their heavy glandular skin unable to shed the heat of a planet that had become a furnace. As the land withered, the heat began to penetrate the oceans, setting the stage for an even greater catastrophe. The water column, which had remained a sanctuary for life for eons, began to absorb the atmospheric carbon, causing the pH of the sea to plummet. This was the birth of the acidic abyss. The biological mechanics of marine life, the calcite shells of the last trilobites, and the complex respiratory systems of the brachiopods began to dissolve in the warming, corrosive brine. The ocean was losing its ability to hold oxygen, becoming a stagnant, thermal trap. We are drifting now into the final hour of the Paleozoic, where the heat would reach a threshold that even the most resilient survivors could not cross. The Great Dying was no longer a threat. It was a physical weight, pressing the spark of life toward the brink of total extinction. The transition from the scorched plains of Pangaea into the depths of the Panthalasic Ocean marks the final, suffocating heartbeat of the Paleozoic era. To understand the Great Dying in the deep, is to witness the arrival of a stagnant, alien world. As the Siberian traps continued to hemorrhage carbon into the sky, the oceans became a thermal sponge, absorbing heat until the surface waters reached the temperature of a hot bath. This heat destroyed the planetary conveyor belt of oceanic circulation. Without the cooling of the poles, the oxygen-rich currents of the surface could no longer sink into the abyss. The result was a global marine anoxia world where the water did not breathe. The abyss was no longer a cold, crushing sanctuary. It had become a hot, stagnant tomb, poisoned by the rise of anaerobic bacteria that exhaled a lethal shroud of hydrogen sulfide. The environment of the terminal Permian Ocean was a sensory nightmare of chemical corruption. The water was no longer blue or green, but a murky purple-black hue, colored by the bloom of sulfur-eating microbes. The smell of the sea was the smell of a graveyard, the pervasive rotten egg stench of hydrogen sulfide gas bubbling up from the lightless trenches. The sensory profile was one of absolute sensory deprivation. As the oxygen vanished, the bioluminescent signals of the deep-sea inhabitants flickered out, leaving the world in a warm, suffocating darkness. The vibration of life, the rhythmic scraping of shells, and the pulsing of fins faded into a terrifying stillness, broken only by the sound of rising gas bubbles and the muffled roar of underwater landslides as entire reef systems crumbled into the silt. The biological mechanics of this collapse were ruthless. 96% of all marine species were extinguished as their respiratory systems failed against the twin pressures of heat and poison. For the last of the trilobites, the chemical shift was an insurmountable wall. The acidification of the water meant they could no longer precipitate the calcite needed for their crystal eyes or their protective carapaces. Their very bodies were being leached of minerals by the water that surrounded them. The cephalopods, masters of the high metabolic hunt, found the warm, oxygen-starved brine unable to support their complex nervous systems. Their hearts, designed for the efficient pumping of hemolymph in cold, oxygen-rich currents, struggled and stopped in the boiling gloom. This was the hypercapnic crisis, where the accumulation of CO2 in the blood led to a total loss of cellular function across almost every phylum of the animal kingdom. Supporting this mass mortality was the total disintegration of the coral and crinoid forests. The symbiotic relationships that had sustained the cities of the deep for millions of years were severed by the thermal stress. The reefs did not just die, they dissolved, leaving behind vast empty plains of skeletal debris that were quickly smothered by thick, slimy carpets of microbial slime. The nervous systems of the survivors, the few, the small and the burrowers, were reduced to a state of metabolic depression, a biological standby mode as they waited for a world that might never recover. As we drift through the hot purple silence of the terminal Permian, we are looking at the closest life has ever come to a total reset. The Paleozoic Abyss, with its armored kings and crystal-eyed watchers, was gone. The slate was being wiped clean by a chemical fire that left only the most primitive ghosts behind. The transition from the thermal chaos of the Great Dying into the long, silent recovery of the Triassic marks the end of our journey through the Paleozoic Abyss. To reflect upon the scale of what has passed is to confront the terrifying and beautiful indifference of deep time. We have traveled from the first conical sparks of life in the Hadean vents, through the crystalline eyes of the trilobite and the armored jaws of the placoderm, to the final suffocating heat of the Permian collapse. The story of the Paleozoic is not a story of progress, but of persistence, a 300 million year cycle of innovation, dominance, and eventual surrender to the shifting chemistry of a restless planet. In the face of such vastness, the entirety of human history is but a single infinitesimal breath in a storm that has been raging since the dawn of the world. The environment of our own time, though it feels solid and eternal, is merely a thin temporary layer of sediment resting upon the bones of these vanished empires. Beneath the ground you walk upon, beneath the floor of the modern ocean, lies the literal weight of the Paleozoic, the limestone carapaces of 1 trillion brachiopods, the carbonized remains of the great coal forests, and the silent, mineralized ghosts of the sea scorpions. The pressure of the deep has not vanished. It has simply moved into the strata of the earth, a geological memory that remains even after the flesh has turned to stone. The sensory landscape of the present is a gift of the past. The oxygen you breathe was forged in the biological revolutions of the Devonian, and the calcium in your bones was once dissolved in the Cambrian brine. The biological mechanics of life have a memory that transcends the individual. The blueprint of your own heart, your own lungs, and the very structure of your limbs was drafted in the estuaries of the Silurian and tested in the humid darkness of the Carboniferous. We are not separate from the abyss. We are its most recent expression. The nervous system that allows you to dream of these ancient worlds is a direct descendant of the one that allowed the Gorgonopsid to track its prey across the Permian dust. To contemplate this lineage is to find a strange, meditative peace in our own insignificance. We are part of a rhythmic planetary pulse that survived 5 mass extinctions and will likely survive the ephemeral presence of our own species. As you drift now into the deep, rhythmic silence of sleep, let the weight of the water and the vastness of time settle over you like a warm, protective shroud. The monsters of the Paleozoic are no longer hunters. They are the quiet architects of your world, their stories etched in the silent geometry of the rocks. The abyss is not a place of fear, but a place of rest, the ultimate cradle from which all complexity arose, and to which all life eventually returns. The darkness is not empty. It is full of the echoes of 1 billion years of striving, a slow, oceanic heartbeat that will continue long after the last star has faded from the sky. You are safe in the hands of time. You are part of the deep. The Paleozoic Abyss is complete. Would you like me to generate a new chapter blueprint for a different era, such as the Mesozoic oceans, the reign of the sea dragons, or perhaps a journey into the Cenozoic, rise of the mammalian giants?